going to today talk about what is Spring Boot and what exactly is the major features of the Spring Boot which is going to help us to create better Java applications. So to give you an introduction, we are going to talk about here two frameworks, that is Spring and your Spring Boot framework. Spring Boot framework is created above or on the top of your Spring framework itself, and these two frameworks, they have actually transformed the entire world of the Java development by introducing many of the features which were not available before they came up into picture. So let's directly jump into it. So why we are going to talk about Spring Framework first. So Spring Framework came up with some features like IOC, that is inversion of control, wherein rather than me creating or rather than me as a developer controlling the creation of an object, execution of an object, and overall life cycle of an object, I am handing over this entire control over to a container which comes as a part of my framework. So now I will just tell my container or my Spring framework that I need an object of a particular class to be created. My Spring or my Spring Boot will be responsible for creating an object and placing it inside a container. And wherever and whenever I want to use that object will be made available to me. So this entire concept is nothing but your inversion of control. So your Spring IOC container manages your application objects, reducing the repetitive code and letting you focus on mainly your business project. You just need to concentrate on your main implementation part. Model View Controller, your Spring MVC framework provides a flexible web architecture with a clear separation of concerns, simplifying the development and testing. So basically, it's giving you an framework which allows you to create web application in which you are dividing your concerns as to what should be the content that should be displayed to the user in form of your view. If I want to interact with my database, what will be the interaction, how exactly will be my interaction, will be controlled with the help of your model, and how exactly the request that is going to come to me, because my request will be coming from a browser with a URL. So that URL mapping with a web page, that entire control will be implemented with the help of your controller. So this overall architecture helps you to create very strong web applications using Java. Lastly, it has also incorporated your ORM frameworks like Hibernate to provide you the flexibility to directly interact with your database without having to write your SQL queries. Because in the traditional environment, if I want to connect with my database in my Java application itself, I will have to write lengthy SQL queries. But ORM and the integration of this ORM within my framework reduces that, restricts that. So these are some of the basic features of your Spring framework. Now let's talk about what is the overall architecture of your Spring framework. So the first part that comes in your Spring framework is your core container. So this is a container using which we are going to maintain our IOC, manage the bean life cycle, and provide the fundamental IOC functionality. The object creation, the placement of this object will be happening in a container, and wherever I want to use this object, I can get it out of my container. Data access and integration, as we discussed in the last slide, ORM is now directly integrated within my Spring framework. So it becomes very easy for me to make the accessibility of my data, direct integration of my database within my application. And we also have a web layer. Web layer in the sense, if this entire application I want to make it on web, I want to make it accessible via the request from the browser, it is quite possible with the help of your framework called as MVC. Now let's talk about, now till now we were talking about Spring framework. Now let's talk about your Spring Boot. What is Spring Boot? Spring Boot, if you see, is an extension of your Spring framework only. It's not something, a very different framework. Whatever were the features of your Spring, same and has been enhanced using your Spring Boot framework. It simplifies the process of building the production ready applications. So the overall production time, the overall production execution, or whatever the things that the developer were doing using the Spring, my Spring Boot has comparatively reduced my production time. The amount it was being spent in creating each and every component of my application is drastically reduced using your Spring Boot. Some of the key features about your Spring Boot is it offers you auto configuration. Like in Spring Framework, if I talk about, majority of the configuration was done manually by the developer using XML files. But that has been reduced or completely removed using your Spring Boot. It has embedded servers in the sense most of my Spring Boot applications are production ready applications wherein you can directly execute them without having to incorporate any external servers within it. Whereas that was a requirement for my Spring Framework. Spring Framework may, if I want to run my web application, externally I have to first add my Tomcat server or my JBoss server, but that is no longer a requirement in my Spring Boot application. Your Spring Boot web application come embedded with your Tomcat server. And it has also provided you with some reduction of the boilerplate code in the sense the repeated code. Rather than you repeating the code again and again, some of your codes will be auto-generated using your Spring Boot. So you as a developer can concentrate mainly on the business logic rather than these small codes that you have to repeatedly write in your application. Relationships to the Spring, obviously Spring Boot is something which has been created on the top of the Spring. So whatever are the different features of your Spring framework are still maintained by your Spring Boot framework. So let's talk about the history and the evolution about Spring Boot. So Spring Boot it was a project started by the Spring company only in year 2013. So Spring project initiated to address the configuration complexity in Spring. All the developers, whatever issues that they were facing with the configuration part, that is what they try to dealt with using Spring Boot. So in 2014, the first release of the Spring Boot came out, which introduced auto configuration and your embedded servers. So no longer the user is supposed to embed external servers within the application itself. The servers are embedded here. Major updates happened in your Spring Boot 2.0, which released with multiple performance improvements and new features. And currently also, if you see regularly in few months, your Spring Boot comes up with new feature. In fact, the current version of the Spring Boot that is going on in the market is Spring 3.3. And it has been regularly updated. The new patches keep on getting updated from the Spring Boot company. Some of the advantages and features that we are getting while we are using the Spring Boot framework. So rapid development, the speed in which my application development is done using Spring Boot is comparatively very higher as if I compare it to my Spring framework. So it accelerates the application development with auto configuration and starter dependencies. Starter dependencies are nothing but the external files, external libraries that can be incorporated within your Spring Boot framework so that you don't have to create everything from scratch. You want a database connectivity to be done, there is a dependency for it. You want to create a REST API application, there is a starter dependency for it. You want to implement security, there is a starter dependency. So for everything, there are starter dependencies. Starter dependencies are nothing but jar files which are created to be used as on go. So whatever your application requirements will be there, you can incorporate that. Embedded servers, so it by default includes your servers like Tomcat, Jetty, Undertow for the easy development and testing. Most of your Spring Boot applications are production ready, means inbuilt within your Spring Boot you have the features to identify the metrics, the performance that is there. You want to measure the performance of your application, so for that you have the implementation. Health check how my application is working. If there are any issue, what exactly is the issue, the log files and everything will be provided to you within the application, means externally you don't have to add it here. And lastly, it has your microservice support. So microservice is the current trend that is going on in the market, wherein you, rather than creating a monolithic application, creating everything into one single application, you divide your application into small microservices so that multiple teams together can work on a single project and they can incorporate their own microservices to create a bigger application. Whereas in monolithic application, what used to happen is one single team used to deal with all the features. So there's a payment feature, there's a security feature. The entire team is responsible for everything. But using microservices, a payment feature is getting developed as a microservice by another team. Whereas my login process or my security process has been developed by another team as a microservices, and we are just incorporating it, thereby reducing the overall production time also, as it was required for creating a monolithic application. So this is one of the major advantage of using your Spring Boot framework. But as any technology has its advantage, even your Spring Boot has its limitations. So what are the limitations of your Spring Boot framework? It's learning curve. Very huge, because first you will have to learn Java programming language, then you will have to understand what are the different auto configurations that are getting implemented, then incorporate those auto configuration, incorporate all these things together can be little bit overwhelming for a person who is trying to do it for the first time. But once you get a hands-on on all these things, it is very easy to go. Size overhead because of these many starter files, because for every small things that you want to incorporate within your Spring Boot, you have to add a starter file, and because of so many starter files, the overall size of your final product, of your final application becomes very huge. That is one of the, I would say, drawbacks of your Spring Boot application. Limited control. See, I as a developer now has a very limited control on my application, because majority of my things are now getting auto configured. So what happened? The problem that is, if I want to do some custom configuration, those custom configurations sometimes might not be properly configured, or might have to do a little bit of an extra step to get this custom configuration. So that is one limitation. But as we said, most of the configuration which are necessary, which are required, will be done for you. Version conflicts. One of the major problem with your Spring Boot, that is still the Spring Boot company coming up, is that whenever they do an update, sometimes because of those updates, the things that are added into new updates are not compatible with their older updates. So this is one issue, one concern the Spring Boot team is currently facing, and they are working on it. Some of the real world applications that we can see based on your Spring Boot. So e-commerce website page, we can work with your microservice architecture, can be used in your e-commerce platform. As I gave an example, for payment we can create a microservice, for security we can create a microservice, for cart implementation we can create a microservice. So there can be different teams playing around a different what I can say, applications of a same big project. Then we have REST APIs that we can create. So REST APIs are nothing but the APIs using which we can implement the background functionality. So rather than me releasing my function directly to the user, we are releasing the APIs. Using the API, my application can be incorporated. Mostly for the CRUD operations, we will be using this REST API. For content management systems, for financial applications, for uh, IoT device app management, for your social media backends, for your data analytics dashboards, for your cloud native applications. These are the different type of an applications that we can create using your Spring Boot. So to just summarize this entire introduction part, we talked about what are the different features of your Spring framework and your Spring Boot framework, and what is the history behind the Spring Boot coming into existence, what are the advantages and the disadvantages of the framework, and what are the real-time examples where we're going to use this framework. I hope this has been useful to you. Thank you.
To know more about IT Vedant, visit our website